I never thought I'd witness the moment when American foreign policy crossed the Rubicon into direct regime change in our own hemisphere. But at 2:47 a.m. Caracas time, everything changed. The call that woke me came from a source inside Southcom I've trusted for 15 years. His voice was barely controlled panic. Operation Phoenix is live. Maduro's been taken. This isn't a drill. In 30 years covering Latin American geopolitics, from Panama to Iraq to Libya, I've never heard that level of strategic shock in a military officer's voice. What unfolded over the next 12 hours represents the most audacious military operation in the Western Hemisphere since the Bay of Pigs, executed with surgical precision that reveals months of planning while the world focused on other crises. This wasn't spontaneous retaliation or escalatory response. This was systematic regime decapitation designed to permanently reshape Venezuelan governance and regional power dynamics. The operation began exactly as planned. Multiple sources confirm that elite special operations forces launched coordinated strikes on 7 primary targets across Venezuela's command structure. Fort Tiuna, the nerve center of Venezuelan military command, took direct hits that neutralized communication capabilities within minutes. La Carlota Air Base, adjacent to Miraflores Palace, was simultaneously struck to prevent any aerial escape or counterattack. But here's what makes this operation historically unprecedented: the extraction phase. While explosions rocked Caracas's military infrastructure, a separate team infiltrated the presidential compound and extracted Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, without firing a single shot. The operational sophistication suggests intelligence assets inside Maduro's inner circle provided real-time location data and security protocols. I've obtained preliminary after-action reports that reveal stunning details about the extraction methodology. The team responsible wasn't Delta Force or Navy SEALs, but a joint CIA military intelligence unit that's been operating in Venezuela for over 18 months. They didn't breach the palace by force. They walked through security checkpoints using credentials that indicate systematic penetration of Maduro's protection apparatus. Trump's social media announcement at 6:23 a.m. Eastern wasn't political theater or strategic messaging. It was operational confirmation that Phase 2 had succeeded beyond intelligence community expectations. When he stated that Maduro and his wife have been removed from the country, he was providing tactical update to allies and adversaries that the Venezuelan government no longer existed in any meaningful form. The geopolitical implications are staggering and extend far beyond Venezuelan borders to fundamental questions about American power projection in Latin America. For decades, Washington has relied on economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and proxy support for opposition movements to influence regional governance. Direct military action represents categorical escalation that redefines acceptable American intervention throughout the hemisphere. What troubles me most as someone who's studied failed regime change operations is how completely this contradicts every lesson we've supposedly learned from Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan. Those interventions collapsed because they lacked viable governance alternatives and sustainable political support. Venezuela faces identical challenges, but the Trump administration proceeded anyway with minimal congressional consultation or international coordination. The Venezuelan military response reveals how thoroughly American intelligence penetrated government command structures. When explosions began, standard protocols required immediate communication with regional commanders and activation of defense networks. Instead, confusion and paralysis dominated official responses. Multiple sources report that senior military officials couldn't contact each other because communication systems had been systematically compromised. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez's public statements demonstrate government desperation rather than strategic coordination. His claims about U.S. invasion for energy resources and attacks on civilian populations follow crisis management scripts designed for external consumption. But internal military communications, portions of which I've reviewed, reveal complete command breakdown and uncertainty about operational continuity. The succession crisis now facing Venezuela illustrates exactly why regime change operations typically fail without comprehensive post-conflict planning. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez constitutionally assumes presidential authority, but lacks meaningful power base outside Maduro's patronage network. Military commanders face impossible choices between resistance against overwhelming American force and accommodation with uncertain political futures. Regional allies Cuba and Nicaragua confront strategic disasters that threaten their own regime stability. Venezuelan oil subsidies and security cooperation represented economic lifelines that sustained both governments against domestic opposition and international pressure. Maduro's removal eliminates those relationships while establishing precedent for similar American interventions against leftist governments throughout Latin America. The human dimension of this operation demands recognition beyond geopolitical calculations. Carolina Alcalde's live reporting from Venezuela captures civilian terror that accompanies sudden regime collapse. Citizens waking to explosions, uncertain whether to flee or shelter, rushing to pharmacies and gas stations in preparation for unknown chaos. This is the immediate cost of strategic decision-making in Washington that prioritizes rapid results over sustainable outcomes. What's particularly disturbing is how completely this operation bypassed democratic oversight and international law. Congress received no advance notification about military action that will reshape hemispheric relations for decades. NATO allies, United Nations leadership, and regional partners learned about American intervention through social media announcements rather than diplomatic consultation. The economic implications began manifesting within hours of Trump's announcement. Oil markets spiked 12% as traders calculated disruption to Venezuelan production and potential extension of conflict to other OPEC members. Latin American currencies experienced massive volatility as investors fled regional assets for safe havens. The economic cost of regime change will exceed hundreds of billions regardless of operational success. International law experts are describing this as the most flagrant violation of sovereignty principles since the 2003 Iraq invasion. Venezuela, whatever its governance failures, represents a sovereign state protected by international law against external military intervention. American justifications about liberating oppressed populations or protecting regional stability lack legal foundation under UN Charter provisions. Chinese and Russian reactions reveal how completely this operation reshuffles global strategic calculations. Both powers have invested heavily in Venezuelan energy infrastructure and geopolitical partnerships that Trump's intervention eliminates overnight. Beijing's emergency Politburo sessions indicate recognition that American willingness to use military force for regime change extends beyond traditional spheres of influence to challenge great power competition directly. The domestic political implications within the United States are equally profound. Trump executed the largest military intervention since Afghanistan without congressional authorization, public debate, or media scrutiny. This establishes precedent for unilateral presidential authority over war and peace decisions that fundamentally alters American democratic governance. Opposition reaction in Congress reveals institutional weakness that enables authoritarian governance expansion. Democratic leadership expressed concern and demanded briefings while stopping short of constitutional challenges that presidential war powers require. Republican support remains predictably partisan despite obvious legal and strategic problems with unilateral military action. What makes this moment uniquely dangerous for American democracy is how completely foreign policy decision-making has been concentrated in presidential authority without institutional constraints. Trump's ability to order regime change operations, announce results through social media, and proceed without meaningful oversight represents systematic breakdown of checks and balances that founders designed to prevent exactly this kind of concentrated power. The intelligence community's role in this operation raises disturbing questions about accountability and democratic control over national security apparatus. Career intelligence professionals who enabled this intervention face congressional investigation, potential criminal liability, and institutional reputation damage. Yet they proceeded based on presidential authority that may lack constitutional foundation. Military leadership confronts similar accountability dilemmas. Professional officers who executed these operations followed orders from constitutional command authority, but legal scholars are questioning whether regime change missions exceed presidential war powers under domestic law. The precedent being established could subject military personnel to future prosecution if political winds change. The propaganda dimensions of this operation deserve analysis beyond immediate tactical success. Trump's announcement strategy, social media first, press conference second, reflects understanding that information warfare matters as much as kinetic operations in modern conflict. Controlling narrative timing allows Washington to establish facts before opponents can organize coherent responses. Venezuelan government communications reveal complete failure to anticipate or counter American information operations. Official statements about U.S. aggression and energy theft sound reactive and defensive rather than strategic. Maduro's regime spent years preparing for economic warfare and diplomatic pressure while completely missing military planning that culminated in leadership extraction. The regional precedent being established terrifies democratic governments throughout Latin America. If Washington can eliminate Venezuelan leadership through direct military action, what prevents similar interventions against any government that challenges American interests? The message to regional partners is clear: accommodation with U.S. preferences or face potential regime change. Looking ahead, the next 72 hours will determine whether this operation represents tactical success or strategic disaster. Military victory means nothing without viable governance alternatives that can maintain stability and legitimacy. Venezuela's institutional collapse, economic crisis, and social fragmentation create conditions for prolonged conflict regardless of Maduro's removal. The humanitarian costs of regime change will mount quickly as basic services collapse, security deteriorates, and refugee flows increase. Neighboring countries already struggling with Venezuelan migration face exponential increases in population displacement. Colombia, Brazil, and regional partners lack capacity to absorb millions of additional refugees that military intervention will generate. International legitimacy for post-Maduro governance remains non-existent outside American sphere of influence. European allies, regional organizations, and major powers view this intervention as illegal aggression that violates sovereignty principles. Building sustainable government requires international cooperation that Trump's unilateral approach has systematically destroyed. The economic reconstruction challenge facing post-intervention Venezuela exceeds Marshall Plan requirements in complexity and scope. Oil infrastructure damage from military operations, institutional collapse, corruption, and international sanctions have created economic devastation that requires decades to address. American taxpayers face potential trillion-dollar commitments to prevent complete state failure. What I find most troubling about this operation is how completely it ignores every lesson from previous regime change failures. Iraq demonstrated that military victory without political planning leads to prolonged occupation and insurgency. Libya showed how leadership elimination creates power vacuums filled by extremist groups. Afghanistan proved that imposed governance lacks legitimacy without indigenous support. Yet the Trump administration proceeded with Venezuelan intervention while ignoring these historical precedents and expert warnings about post-conflict challenges. The hubris required to believe that Venezuelan regime change would succeed where previous interventions failed suggests dangerous disconnection from strategic reality. The intelligence preparation for this operation reveals systematic penetration of Venezuelan government that required years to establish. Sources indicate that CIA assets had been placed within Maduro's security apparatus since 2021, providing real-time intelligence about presidential movements, security protocols, and command structures. The operational success depended entirely on this human intelligence network that recent events have now exposed and destroyed. The economic warfare dimensions of Venezuelan intervention extend beyond immediate military costs to fundamental questions about dollar hegemony and international financial stability. Maduro's removal eliminates a government that had been actively challenging American monetary dominance through alternative currency oil sales. Regional partners will interpret this intervention as warning against deviation from dollar-based trading systems. European allies face impossible diplomatic positions balancing legal principles against strategic relationships with Washington. NATO's collective defense obligations don't extend to offensive interventions, but political solidarity becomes impossible when core members act without consultation. The technological aspects demonstrate capabilities that reshape global strategic calculations. The ability to neutralize Venezuelan command systems within minutes indicates cyber warfare integration with kinetic operations that few nations can match. China and Russia are analyzing these tactics to understand vulnerabilities in their own defense networks. Brazilian response will determine whether Venezuelan intervention triggers broader regional instability or isolated crisis. President Lula's government faces enormous pressure from domestic military establishment to support American action while confronting constitutional obligations to defend sovereignty principles. Brazil's decision about border security and refugee assistance will influence whether Venezuelan collapse remains contained or spreads throughout South America. Cuban regime survival now depends entirely on relationships with China and Russia as Venezuelan support evaporates overnight. The precedent of American regime change in Venezuela creates existential threat to Cuban governance that may trigger desperate responses, including military alliance with hostile powers or accelerated nuclear cooperation. The risk of Caribbean militarization increases exponentially. The constitutional crisis now facing the United States extends beyond foreign policy to fundamental questions about democratic governance and institutional constraint. presidential authority to order regime change operations without congressional approval represents monarchical power that founders explicitly rejected. This precedent endangers American democracy as much as Venezuelan sovereignty. As I finish writing this analysis, reports indicate that resistance elements within Venezuelan military are organizing counter-operations against American occupation forces. What began as surgical extraction is evolving into open-ended military commitment that could last years or decades. The easy phase, removing Maduro, has ended. The impossible phase, building sustainable governance, has begun. The world is watching American response to this self-created crisis while calculating whether democratic institutions can constrain presidential power or collapse under authoritarian pressure. Venezuelan regime change represents more than foreign policy decision. It's a test of whether constitutional democracy survives concentrated executive authority. History will judge whether Operation Phoenix represented strategic brilliance or catastrophic overreach. But for millions of Venezuelans facing uncertain futures and Americans confronting constitutional crisis, the immediate costs are already devastating. Trump captured Maduro, but the real question is whether democracy survives the victory.